happy to call to order the Parks and Recreation Committee of the Bellingham City Council. I'm Roxanne Murphy, chair of the committee. I'm joined by fellow committee members, Councilmember Vargas, Councilmember Weiss. And we have three, I think, agenda items today. The first is an agreement with Bellingham Technical College for the Perry Center lease and facility use agreement at Maritime Heritage Park and public parking facility use agreement at Bellingham Technical College main campus. So basically a little bit of background on this issue is that there has been a fisheries technology program at Maritime Heritage Park since 1978, and that program has been in an older building. We found that it would just going to not make sense for us to renovate that building to bring it up to current code and status for structural soundness and such. And so basically what Bellingham Technical College decided to do was get up enough funding, and they built a building. Tore down the old one, built a new building. Now what we need to do is consider a lease with the state of Washington due to that change in the building ownership and management. So the lease would consider everything from infrastructure to fish ponds, parking, and common areas. And I'll let James take it away for the rest.
Okay, thank you. James King, Parks and Recreation Department. So the lease, they actually own the building, and the lease will be for the land and the other infrastructure, pipes and tanks and other things that are there. And as you mentioned, that program's gone on for a long time in that location, and I think they're thrilled to have a more adequate building to be operating their fisheries program out of. So now that there's a new building, it's time to do a new lease, and Leslie and Peter have worked very hard on this lease for quite some time, and so we're very excited to be bringing it forward to you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie to give you some details on it.
So it's a requirement that City Council approve leases, and we are not asking BTC to pay the market rate to lease this land, and so therefore council approval is needed. They have not, well, they used to pay us $1 per year, but that's almost more paperwork. What we did negotiate was, again, basically a no-cost lease. However, they are going to pay us $6,000 each year because we agreed to maintain the safety railings around the fish ponds. Since we're maintaining other railings down at the site, it just made more sense for us to do that all together. So they're going to pay us for that. Also, as a part of this lease agreement, they will fulfill a commitment that they've had for a while, actually, to provide parking on their main campus for Little Squalicum Park. So that gets memorialized as part of this lease. They maintain, as James said, not only the building, the interior and exterior of the building, but the landscape beds that were constructed as part of this new building. There's some retaining walls that were constructed, and of course they maintain all of the hatchery facilities, the ponds, the intake pipe, the rearing channel, and all of those facilities as well. And we shared with the public is the parking area at the park, as well as the plaza and the walkway. So that's part of the area that they use, but that's also shared with the park. And I think unless those are the main parts of the terms of the lease.
Council members, any questions? Councilmember Weiss.
So, Leslie, I was part of the comprehensive plan, or I'm sorry, the institutional master plan that the college had put together. This was like 2-3 years ago, maybe. And I'm fully supportive of the lease part of it. I'm a little concerned about the fact that this is a 50-year lease, in essence, and that master plan was for like 20 years or so of development. And when you look at what the college wants to do in the next 20 years, or maybe even more, it's pretty clear that they're going to be needing to have structured parking as a condition of being able to maximize the number of students that they want to serve on the footprint of their campus. And having structured parking, they probably are going to go to a paid parking plan of some sort. And I would imagine that students, right now they have free parking, and that I would imagine that they will need to go into paid parking. So with that, it didn't seem like the lease really addressed that, whether or not the public would then have to go and pay for parking as a condition of being able to use the park, or if they're, because it's first come, first serve, and then the management of how you work that out.
We talked about that in our discussions, that they could go to a permit parking system or a paid parking system. We could also potentially change the parking down at Maritime Heritage Park and do some parking in association with 600 West Holly. And so we tried to put in the lease that if these things happen, we need to negotiate in good faith for something different. We identified 3 different places on the BTC campus where they could provide parking, and one is at the old Oak Harbor Freight site, which they now own.
Yeah.
The other, where the structured parking is likely to go, is the area that's closest to the park. And they also have that upper parking off of West Illinois, where we also now have a trail easement adjacent to that parking that leads from Illinois down to the park. So that is where the current parking is, where they've identified that they would like it to be, but it's possible that that would be renegotiated.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that are starting to use the parking lot where the structured parking will eventually happen. There's quite a few that used it over the weekend.
And I think most people using that parking for the park would be during the hours that school is not necessarily in session, weekends, summer, evenings, so it hopefully can be a good shared parking arrangement.
Move approval of the lease then?
Second. Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
No opposed? Okay, we will bring this forward tonight during our evening meeting. Next up, we have the Cornwall Beach Park Master Plan. So Cornwall Beach Park is something that we've been working on for quite a bit, especially in gathering input about it. The Cornwall Beach Park has been identified as a community park in the Park and Recreation and Open Space chapter of the city's comprehensive plan, and it's also been identified as a future park within the waterfront sub-area plan. So this whole Cornwall Beach Master Park Plan has been has received significant community input through public meetings, steering committee, and also coordination between the city and the port staff. And so we'll have a great discussion today about it, especially about the cleanup and future development of this park. So, James, please take it away.
Thank you. So, as you know, as a master plan, it's a concept for the development in the future. It doesn't have a lot of the right down to the dirt detail. We put this concept together so that it could be, so that it could inform the cleanup, and hopefully the cleanup could benefit the future development of the park. It's important also to note that thinking about the development of this particular park, that it'll be done in phases, and that those phases will come along as resources, particularly funding, is available. So it would start out as largely a big lawn and some trails potentially, and then other infrastructure would be added over time as funding becomes available. And it's also important to note that as those pieces of the park get designed, it's a more in-depth planning effort to plan those, and there'll be more public participation as the nitty-gritty detail gets worked out through those processes. So again, this is an overview, a concept plan. So with that, Leslie's worked really hard on this, and I'm going to turn the time over to her.
Thank you. Leslie Bryson, Development Manager for Bellingham Parks and Recreation, and I'm here today to ask you to approve the master plan for Cornwall Beach Park. We've given you updates on this in the past, and I think last time was in June, and there really aren't many significant changes since then. We've just done a lot more refinement to the plan. We wanted to time this process so we could coordinate as the cleanups for both the Cornwall Avenue landfill process and the R.G. Haley go forward. And to that end, we included the site manager, Amy Cram, for R.G. Haley, and Brian Gowan from the port for Cornwall Avenue landfill were on our team. We met on a regular basis. That also included Steve Sundin from the planning department, and Renee LaCroix from Public Works, and also Craig Mueller from Public Works. coordinating with Amy and Brian also allowed us to include input and communication with the consultant teams that are working specifically on those 2 cleanup sites. We developed a park vision statement early on for the project that Cornwall Beach Park would be an iconic destination for all ages, abilities, and interests, offering a variety of recreational opportunities and waterfront access with enhanced habitat for wildlife. And this is something that we worked on with our stakeholders and our city staff team, so everybody had a similar vision for the park project. The site is large. It's quite a bit larger, several acres larger than Boulevard Park. It's about 14 acres of upland and 3 acres of tideland area are included in the park site. And if you went out there, I know a couple of council people went out for the walk we had, public walk we had in April, and that was one of the comments people had as how large the park is. And the other one was, how soon can we get out here and enjoy it? So we had quite a bit of public involvement over the last 18 months as we worked on this. We had 3 steering committee meetings. Our steering committee was made up of neighborhood members and community stakeholders. We had 3 public meetings. Our most recent was on July 31st. We had the 1 site tour with 130 people showed up for that. We had 3 park board updates, and then they recommended approval of the plan last month, and then a couple of council updates, and then this final presentation. As I mentioned, there are the 2 MOTCA sites here, the Cornwall Avenue landfill and R.G. Haley, and I believe Amy Cram gave you an update on the progress of these 2 sites at your last meeting. We also developed guiding principles for the park based on what we were hearing from the community, that we wanted to have a wide range of opportunities for people to go down beyond the waterfront, have that connection to the water. We wanted the site to be safe and secure. We want it to be a waterfront recreation destination. People are excited about having another waterfront park, since Boulevard Park is probably the most visited and popular park in Bellingham. We also wanted to possibly provide an opportunity for commercial services for park users, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the plan. We want to design for environmental sustainability and reduce our maintenance costs as we look at how we design the park. We always look at incorporating crime prevention through environmental design principles in our park sites. We also added the component of fish and wildlife habitat into the master plan, so we can make sure that we don't preclude that as the cleanup goes forward, that habitat can be incorporated either with the cleanup or following the cleanup, habitat improvements within the intertidal zone area. And as I mentioned, it was important to design this in collaboration with the industrial site cleanup, and also, of course, to preserve and enhance the wonderful views of the park site. So as I mentioned, this is very similar to the plan you saw back in June with some refinements. There's a large open area for community events, for people to play, fly kites, hang out, run. There's a large upland beach at the south area that's outside of the shoreline setback. There is shoreline habitat within the shoreline setback along the shoreline, the entire shoreline. Habitat improvement in the intertidal zone along the entire shoreline. A berm along the railroad or a sound wall to help buffer from the railroad noise and also to provide a safety separation from the railroad. Large berm and a hill for viewing, to have a natural amphitheater for concerts and other events, a large children's playground with possibly a spray park. This is a large picnic shelter, and this is a pavilion, enclosed pavilion building similar to what we have at Blodell Donovan Park. We also have a couple of smaller picnic shelters out by the beach area. Plenty of parking. One of the comments we heard is there's not enough parking at Boulevard Park for a lot of the large events. This also is a good way to cap the R.G. Haley site with parking. We identified a couple of areas for commercial facilities. One might be located here and could be a hand-carried watercraft site, which could launch here at the beach for rentals of kayaks or stand-up paddle boards or bikes. There could also be a cafe or coffee shop associated with the site. We also provided plenty of area to allow for seasonal food vendors, food trucks to come in for special events that could have place to park. And then the entrance is narrow, so doing something at the entryway to have a nice gateway so people realize when they've arrived. And then also having opportunity for public art throughout the site. Bike parking, lighting, safety lighting, not lighting for nighttime use. And possibly some, well, we have the through trail through the site that would connect to the overwater walkway, and then circular pedestrian paths through the site. We developed some cross sections to show how the habitat would work in with the site. This is the South Beach area, the upland beach that I talked about. The dashed line in the background are the mounds of material that are on the site right now. Habitat going down into the intertidal area. As you go around the corner, it becomes a bit steeper and showing a habitat bench in this area. A couple other cross sections as we move north. There's a pocket beach and then also the parking area. And this shows the same and another habitat bench here for that shoreline habitat connectivity that is important, a priority for the city to have along the bay. This shows the parking area with the treatment facility for the parking. We don't anticipate that we would be able to have infiltration at this site because of the landfill, because of the cap over the R.G. Haley site. And then showing how we might buffer the railroad in this area. The other two cross sections are up at the north end at the Cornwall Cove Beach and at the berm, and I'll just show those really quickly. Again, a nice gentle graded beach at that north end for hand-carrying boats into the water. And then this shows the hill climb and the berm. And up here on top of the hill where we have a big depth over the cap, we can have most of our tree planting up there to have that other habitat area at the back of the park. As James mentioned, we would likely develop this park in phases as funding is available. This is just one, this shows an option of how we might develop, starting mostly with, initially with most of the earthwork and grading associated with the park and the landfill cap and seeding and grading and maybe implementing the habitat in the shoreline area, building the berm, then adding some parking and trails, and finally implementing most of the facilities. We did develop a cost estimate, which at a master plan phase is not real accurate. It includes a 35% contingency because it's based on concepts and not on design of actual facilities. The $12 million, we did estimate $12 million for development of the upland portion of the park when we gave council the cost for the total waterfront, the city's portion of waterfront redevelopment a few years ago. The habitat elements would add approximately another $7 million, and if we had private developer funded commercial sites, the concession for recreational rentals or a cafe, that would be another $2 million. Again, these all include 35% contingency, so we're looking at a pretty high level cost for the park. As we go forward, we would have additional public meetings to help refine the site plan and the specific design, but any major changes to the master plan would have to come back to City Council. So our next steps after you approve the plan, we will continue to coordinate with the design of the cleanup of the two sites and implement the master plan elements with the cleanup as practical, and then we'll develop the park as funding is available with additional public input. Oftentimes people think, well, you've had all this public input for the master plan. But we do have a lot more public input as we develop each phase.
Great. Committee, any questions? Councilmember Weiss.
First off, a year ago when we were actually zoning this, it seemed like we were going down a different path, and everybody said just wait until the master plan was done. And when I saw this on the agenda, I was very apprehensive about even opening up the packet. But as I read through it, I'm really pleased with the work that everybody's done on this. It's a really good plan, I think, overall. And it doesn't have 300,000 square feet worth of condos in it, as we approved. It is minimizing the amount of development on the south side of the park. I think that, these are really good things. It is taking advantage of capping the R.G. Haley part with parking. It's providing enough habitat restoration. It's providing enough access to the beach with 3 pocket beaches. There's a lot of really good things in there. I did have some questions, though, as far as, and these are just, I guess, relatively minor. Is the stormwater treatment facility area, is that just going to be an open area, or is it going to be fenced off as some of our ponds are?
This would be a shallow pond that would be, we wouldn't fence it. That would
Similar
be
to
the intent.
what was built in Squalicum Creek
Yes,
Park?
yes.
Okay, that's great.
Landscaped, planted.
Okay, and the provisions for trees, you had some up against the railroad bluff, and then there were, I think, smaller trees along the waterfront area?
Yes, a couple areas we're showing these darker green areas could be, in order to plant trees over the landfill, we have to have a depth of soil that would allow for the tree roots not to penetrate. So we would have to berm up those areas, we'd have to bring in additional soil. The team, including the city staff team, felt that we didn't want to have a berm along the whole shoreline because that would block access, block views. So we showed it periodically along the shoreline where we could maybe increase that depth of soil and have larger plants, trees along the shoreline. There would certainly be landscaping in the shoreline buffer. And then up at the top of the berm, of course, we'd have the depth where we could have more trees up there.
And then last question, just looking at the gradient on the south end Pocket Beach, does that mean that...
Oops, that's the wrong one.
Well, you can go back there, just...
Yeah, this is the south one. Is
okay.
That, yeah.
Is
okay.
there going to be enough... are we going to be digging into the existing mess that's there now in order to be able to create, the gradient to go all the way back into the site?
That's not the intent that we would do that. It's if we did, we talked about could that material stay on site and go into the berm. We don't know the answer to that yet. So there are some unknowns, and until the final cleanup plan is done, we have to make some assumptions about how this will work, but it's preferable not to dig into the landfill. But if there is an opportunity to create a better, so this I think the gray or lower gray on the cross section is the cap, and everything else, all the habitat goes on top of that.
Okay. And then I guess I did have one last question. From my recollection a year ago, when we were dealing with the rest of the waterfront site, I believe that we were using a 50-inch metric for sea level rise over 100-year, and this seems like it's about a little bit more than half for this particular plan. It says 2.4 feet. Is that going to be a problem if we're using, first of all, different guidelines as to what our expectations are for sea level rise?
Well, the park will be built on top of the cap, so the cap will have a certain depth, and that cap will then have topsoil on top of it. and everything else will go on top of that. So we're not in the final design yet. If we need to modify that,
Well, it seems like the plan's built at 2.4 feet, and we approved an overall expectation of, or anticipation of just a little over 4 feet.
Okay.
And just whether or not this design, the way it is, if we can actually handle the extra 2 feet in case the worst case scenario does happen.
Amy, do you want to respond to that, if you can?
I don't have, unfortunately, the waterfront district plan right in front of me, but I believe we were going to depend upon the best available science for sea level rise, and I thought that we actually amended that pursuant to a conversation that we had regarding this towards the end of the process. But we can certainly make sure that whatever is in the plan is consistent with what the master plan has.
Okay.
Councilmember Vargas.
I concur with Jack. I think this plan looks terrific. Really nice job. Thank you so much. I'm curious about the estimated timeline, phase 1, 2, and 3, kind of what we're projecting.
Well, if we can implement any part of the master plan with cleanup, doing some grading, the seeding, if we can implement any of the habitat, that would be great. Otherwise, but that may depend on having the funding available to do that. Otherwise, it's kind of dependent on funding. I think we're looking at possibly the cleanup construction for both sites being done by 2017, 16, 17. So at that point, we can start budgeting for phase 1, start working on the phase 1 design, and hope. I mean, once the cleanup is done, we should be able to at least open it to the public for access. The cap will be in place. There will be topsoil. It'll be seeded. We can possibly put some trails in place, a loop trail in place with that cleanup, and open it to the public shortly after that, and then work towards additional implementation.
Again, I'm not holding you to this, but you said so maybe by 2017 we might be able to have people there?
If the cleanup is done and both sites are done, and we can open it at that time. Is that fair? Okay. I think that's
I would say that's consistent with the current schedule.
Okay. Thank you.
Council members, any other questions or feedback? Councilmember Lilliquist.
Thank you, Roxanne. In the documents and materials, not in the plan itself, but in some of the other materials, it talked about changing the wiggle in the rail line there. I'm not a big fan of the fastest trains in the world, but the Burlington Northern is, and there's some discussion about changing the rail alignment, and now would be the chance to do it before we put in a retaining wall and build 15 feet of dirt berms. And I'm particularly interested in rail issues. It'll come up later today with regard to our legislative agenda, having to do with safety improvements at crossings and the fact that it might be part of a kind of a general discussion of rail alignment through downtown. Given the fact that there a rail realignment, a small one in this area, but 15, 20 feet, how does that affect this master plan? How does it affect cleanup planning? How does it affect the other elements?
I believe that, and I'll have to defer to Amy and Brian, but I believe that realignment area is outside of most of the cleanup. I'm not sure. It's inside the boundary. So that would have to happen first. We are aware of that alignment. There's actually been a sketch of it. Everything would basically move in this master plan would move waterward, but we'd still have the same basic concepts. But
before you start putting in money for retaining walls and berms, it might be nice to know, because moving it later is not going to happen.
Oh, I agree. We would not put that money into this before we know the answer to that.
So Michael, we had this discussion early on. What do we do with that? Because it's not moved now, we decided to do the master plan with it not moved. But as we mentioned before anything gets done, we have to do these site-specific designs. At that point, it would be the time to really wrestle through that and decide. is it going to be 20 feet to one side or the other in order to accommodate?
Actually,
but for master
I think I
plan,
disagree. That's too late. If we're starting to go into phase one, I assume we're sort of talking with the railroad a little bit all along with regard to our other crossing issues. It seems to me this is part of that larger discussion. This is part of the give and take we can do with the railroad in terms of maybe financial contributions to crossing safety in exchange for changes in alignment. I think this discussion either needs to be starting now, or it may be too late in 2 years when we have to commit to cleanup.
We made the decision to show the park without the realignment, so we show the full area of ownership of the city and what the impact would be on the park for relocating the railroad. And it's definitely doable. It moves everything further. And so we need to continue to have those discussions and certainly not start a design of something before that's determined.
And I'll just say that those discussions are happening. So because it would be foolish to make investments we'd have to change. So there's not a decision, but there's a discussion.
With regard to the railway, the design shows a 15-foot high retaining wall, which is, I think, the single most expensive element. It's $480,000. I have two concerns about that. One, my guess is that a 15-foot wall is not just 50%, half again as much difficulty as a 10-foot retaining wall. I mean, I think it gets harder and harder the higher you go. The loads increase, probably geometrically, but I'm not sure of that. What about a slightly lower retaining wall? And another issue there has to do with safety. If you're on the wrong side of that wall, you're in a canyon now, or you would be in a canyon now. I'm just wondering if there's kind of some safety issues if a lower wall, and a lower wall, but then the berm would go up. I'm not saying a lower berm, but I'm just concerned that may not be the best design for that particular feature. And it might save cost to lower it by 5 feet.
Well, we talked about different heights of wall, and we can certainly revisit that when we get into the design. We were looking at the possibility of double-decker trains at some point, and this was like the ultimate would be to have the higher wall. Whether we actually build it that tall or shorter, that kind of that's somewhat based on budget, but people wanted to see a good barrier, a good sound wall for the railroad. So that's what we've put into the master plan. It is expensive.
I do appreciate, I too want a sound barrier wall, but I don't think we can build a wall to handle double-decker trains, and we shouldn't try to afford that. I think we should put in as much as we can afford. That's what I'm saying.
Councilmember Weiss.
Move approval of the master plan.
Second.
All right, there's been a motion and a second to approve the Cornwall Beach Master Plan. And Councilmember Lillquist.
Well, I won't be voting on this. I'm not on the committee, but I did want to talk a little bit, if not now, then this evening, about the nearshore habitat work and protections, which are in here. Shall I save it for later, or, it won't affect your vote?
Anyway,
Yeah.
I think you should save it for later. That's just my opinion.
Let's save it for tonight, if that would work
Okay.
for you. Okay, so we have a motion and a second to approve the Cornwall Beach Master Plan. Any other additional feedback or questions? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. No one opposed. We will bring this forward tonight with unanimous support. And our last item is additional spending authority for the 2014 golf course project. So the Parks Department needs $70,000 in additional spending authority to complete the pond restoration project, and this funding would come from the golf course fund. So, Leslie?
This is all James. I'm just.
So I'm going to take this one, and I'm going to start with this beautiful picture. And it's a little hard to see, but you can see up there on the top, in 1970, that's what the pond at the golf course looked like. And then the middle picture is what it looked like this spring as we were getting ready to clean it out. It had silted in and almost completely covered over with cattails. It was causing all kinds of drainage problems in the golf course itself because many of the drain systems drain into that, and they had completely covered over, backing water up into the fairways. So the bottom picture is what it looked like at the end of the summer once we were done digging out the cattails and reestablishing it as a pond. And so those of you who've been around for a while know that this project has been in the works for a long time, and it was good to finally get it off the list. So that particular project, we ran into some challenges. We did not anticipate the 150 fish that were in the pond, and we were required to remove those ever so delicately. So we did that, and there was some other research and design that cost us more than we anticipated. So it cost us an extra $53,000 to go through the extra design, environmental work, and other processes. In addition to that, we had about $17,000 worth of emergency repairs at the golf course, water heaters, and our weather station, which helps guide the irrigation system and other things that broke. So we're asking for additional spending authority of $70,000. This is funding that's in the enterprise fund already. It's just asking for the additional authority to spend that money.
Councilmember Weiss.
What will be the balance on the reserve fund then after this?
Off the top of my head, I don't have a spreadsheet in front of me. It's about, so we have $75,000 contingency fund that's still in there. There's an additional $35,000 at the end of the year in addition to that 75. So it's a little over $100,000.
What species of fish did you find?
They found rainbows and stickleback, actually quite a few rainbows that were fairly good size, which surprised everybody because they usually like cold water.
Yeah.
And this was a pretty warm little thing. And so they had to, it was interesting, they had to get nets and dip them out of there one by one as they were dewatering the pond and put them in 5-gallon buckets and take them down to Lake Padden and put them back in the water.
So it has no fish now?
You know, there was one that they put back in.
Okay.
So I assume over time it'll come back.
How many balls did you fish out?
You know, okay, so you're asking for stories here. So they had an excavator in there, a smaller one because it's muddy. We needed the lighter machine to get in there. It drove around for a couple of days in there and the track fell off and they called the mechanic to come fix it. He picked over 100 balls out of the track. So they were everywhere. There were thousands of balls in there. Every scoop was just completely full of them.
Wow.
Yeah.
I don't need any more. A vote to approve.
Second.
We have a motion to approve additional spending authority for the 2014 golf course project. Are there any other questions or feedback? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. So this will come forward tonight with the unanimous recommendation. Anything else, council members, for the betterment of our parks and recreation? Seeing nothing, end of committee.